Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and you are in for an Uber treat today because I am in for an Uber treat today. And the reason we're both in for an Uber treat today is I finally, after way too long, have Pat Poitevin or something like that, close enough for Texan, on the pod. So, Pat, I can pronounce Pat because that was my mother's name. So we'll go with
Oh, there you
that.
go.
Welcome to the podcast, and thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me today.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to have join you on this podcast.
You have been in the compliance profession probably as long as I have, but you've had a different variety of roles than I've had. You've been on the enforcement side,
Yes.
you've been on the consulting side, you've been in the practice side, you've written extensively. You're about to start a podcast, which I'm thrilled about. Could you give our audience your professional background?
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, it's been a quite a journey. So I started my career in the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, where I was there for 35 years, and I was the anti-corruption compliance expert for the RCMP. So I had multiple roles. One, it was assisting the investigative teams, but also evaluating the rigor of ethics and compliance program of companies we were investigating. And part of my role was to focus on outreach and prevention. So working with companies and business groups in raising awareness and helping them build their capacity to prevent, detect, and mitigate risk. So bringing the principles and practices of crime prevention, social development, crime prevention, environmental design to the corporate world, because investigating corruption is very complex. It costs a lot of money. It takes a lot of time. So the powers of be gave me the license, and I was in charge of my unit to really work with companies in order to prevent it. And also, while I was doing that, I co-founded the Canadian Center of Excellence for Anti-Corruption with the University of Ottawa, with a professor there, to basically help inform, especially SMEs, because they were underserved, to help them generate awareness, to influence also the next generation of business leaders in the law school and business schools. And so I've been working around the world with organizations, businesses, helping train people, helping businesses up their game in terms of ethics and compliance, and focusing on prevention and building their capacity. And I started, after I retired in 2017, Active Compliance and Ethics Group. So it's a boutique advisory firm that helps businesses in terms of advice, guidance, support for E&C programs, and also implementation of AI solutions. So I've been around. I was on the committee for the Canadian committee that developed the ISO 37001, 02, and also 42001, which is the AI governance.
So, what are some of the projects you have going on or you're working on right now?
Right now, the two things. One is with the center, again, to increase the capacity and knowledge to help, especially SMEs, increase their knowledge to be able to mitigate risk more effectively because they're underserved and they lack capacity and knowledge to do that. And I'm working with local colleges and universities to do that. And on the advisory side is helping companies really up their game in terms of ethics, compliance, and risk management, but leveraging AI to do that.
And let's go into some of the areas of a compliance program that I know you have written about, you've talked about, you've lectured on. So let's start with building a strong ethics and compliance culture. Where do you advise a company on to start with on that?
You know, when you've been talking about ethics and compliance and culture for a long time yourself, and of course, when you look at businesses, what they're most scared about, they're dealing with risk, they're dealing with uncertainty. And because the risk is prevalent in a lot of businesses, we need to use a common language and how to build that. It's not just on pieces of paper, having policies, but how do you build a culture? How do you make people aware of what they're facing for risk, but also embedding compliance and ethic within the management structure? So building an ethics and compliance culture that's anchored on risk management mindset to really motivate people and incentivize leaders, but also staff to care and to be proactive to prevent, detect, and mitigate risk.
How do you take those concepts to a wider group that I'm just going to start by calling other stakeholders?
Really, it's to answer basic questions for me. And I've always used this in my trainings is why should you care? How is this going to be improving your job? And why is it important for any organization to look at to having a strong ethics and compliance culture to be able to mitigate risk more effectively? Because it's all about collective action. It's about incentivizing all the stakeholders within the organization, not just the senior leaders and the managers, but why should staff and why should people working at the tail end that have a role within the organization, but why should they care in terms of risk management? Because ultimately they are part of that success story for the organization. But unless it's built within the culture, if they're not incentivized, if they're not engaged, if they don't care, they're not going to be looking and be proactive about identifying risk and doing something about it or raising their hand. So it's really important to look at ethics and compliance, not just from a policy perspective or process perspective, but how are you engaging your staff, all your stakeholders within your own organization, your supply chain, to really up their game in that area.
If a company takes these steps, Pat, can they maybe reframe how compliance looks, that it's not simply regulatory protection, it's not simply reputational protection, but it actually you can incorporate it into corporate strategy and long-term growth as a business enabler?
Absolutely. Ethics and compliance today is not just the checks and balances in terms of boarding your TPRM, third party risk management, or your partner or anything else. It's really about embedding risk and compliance within strategy so that everybody has a role to play and a stake in it, because ultimately is the data is shown is that if people are engaged, not only do they are better able to manage, predict, and protect the organization, but it increases productivity, it increases clarity, it increases the way people are looking at issues and problems more effectively because they are really engaged within for the success of the organization. And it's not just a policy statement. They care, but they have to be valued. They have to be engaged from the management perspective and the culture perspective, that it is part of the ethos within the organization and it's aligned with their own personal values and it's aligned also with the corporate values. So everything has to mesh or else people are going to be detached from the reality of things.
How do you see AI taking these concepts and either speeding them up, making compliance more efficient, or perhaps taking things in an even different direction, Pat?
AI really, if you look at how AI is transforming how people are doing business today, it's everybody is going on the AI bandwagon. You know, it's this huge hype about it, but it's transformative in terms of how organization and people can manage risk and identify the key elements, looking at data from a data analytics perspective. And it's a really game changer for the ethics and compliance function because it allows ethics and compliance function and anybody using AI properly and effectively to automate tasks, to become AI now has become a digital assistant that is really a force multiplier. And it leaves people, when you use your digital assistant, it leaves people to concentrate on material and strategic tasks as opposed to doing the rote work that is boring people. It is changing the way we can look at risk management, because instead of having a little sampling and auditing of things, you can do this continuously in terms of continuous monitorship of all transactions out there. So it is a game changer for the compliance function.
Pat, one of the things I have advocated is that by using the strategies you've articulated here, a business in the United States is better suited to respond to, or at least be prepared for, the administration's changes in sanctions and tariffs and a wide variety of other areas. Unfortunately, you sit on the other side of that fence. in some ways in Canada.
Yes.
And it just struck me that can these strategies that you have articulated around risk management, robust risk management, and the use of AI in risk management help a company who's also having to respond to these changes, or at least maybe prepare for several different scenarios that you can game out or plan for? And then if one of them does, you can implement it as a business enabler.
Yeah. Throughout history, you've seen changes in technology, in geopolitical settings. Throughout the last few decades, you've seen a lot of evolution of technology and regulatory frameworks. So and risk is not new for businesses. Now, the scope and pace of the geopolitical challenge that we're facing and the scope and pace of the technology AI adoption has never been seen before, like what we're dealing with today. But this is where, if you have a strong foundation within an organization, if people are properly trained in terms of risk management, they're engaged within the organization, they're much more able to look at whatever is on the horizon, whatever they're facing, to be able to manage it more effectively, because they have the agility and the mandate and the support from management to say, okay, we're facing this issue. How can we be more effective in dealing with it? What tools do we have to be able to manage this huge challenge that we're facing? Because it's all ultimately about data and being aligned with the business objectives. How can we give our people the ability to be able to manage these various challenges, where we give them the tools to do it more effectively? And this is where technology and the culture comes into play, where technology allows data, more business intelligence, risk intelligence at your fingertips, where in the past it could take days or weeks to get analysis or get access to data. Now you can get it in seconds, minutes. So it changes the game, where you have a much clearer picture of what's happening. But also on the flip side, if you are enabled to be creative, to be innovative in terms of problem solving, in terms of critical thinking, then you can propose solutions that are based on that data that will help the organization navigate the various challenges they're facing.
Now, let me change the focus a little bit to policies and procedures versus human behavior. 15 or 20 years ago, one of the debates in training was, do you teach the rules or do you talk about values? So how do you help think through the rules versus the values, or do you find them complementary in a way that you can bind both together?
You have to find a right balance of it, because if you look at policies, controls by themselves are not effective. You can't expect a change of behavior or change of perception by just writing a policy, because an organization is facing challenges and they write a policy and they expect change of behavior. You can't do that if people don't, first of all, trust the organization and that the policy or the control makes sense to them. Because if it doesn't make sense, if the employee doesn't have the buy-in, that policy becomes a zombie rule, meaning they're going to find any way to circumvent it to achieve their goals. Because the reality is that in business, there's still that pressure to perform. How are you going to achieve your goal at the end of the day? And if the pressure at 2:00 on a Friday afternoon, you need to write this report from the boss, guess what you're going to use? You're going to use the tools at your disposal. And if you don't have the right culture, if you don't have the right framework, and let's say you don't have policy related to the use of AI, whether it's ChatGPT or Microsoft Copilot or anything else, they're going to use it anyway. They're going to circumvent the rule. Why? Because that pressure to perform is there. So unless you build a really good ethics and compliance culture where people have the boundaries, they know what they need to do, and they know that they can raise their hand and ask the right questions, this is where problems, risk, and major issues can arise. So human behavior science is based on people's perception of things. It's not just on policy. So if you build within your structure, within your organization, very strong ethical culture, people are more likely then to make the right decision because they have that agency, they have the tools, and they trust the process because they are valued within that ecosystem.
Paul, let me maybe turn to your time as an enforcer with the RCMP and what you may be seeing now. This administration has made clear they highly value self-disclosure, extensive cooperation in an investigation, remediation during that investigation, and profit disgorgement, if applicable. I guess I should say it's always applicable because you always make profits. But from the Canadian enforcement side, are there any particular emphasis you are seeing now along those lines or other lines?
Yeah, we have our own version of DPAs in Canada. And when companies self-disclose and they can demonstrate that they've remediated, that they are collaborating with law enforcement and prosecutors, then they're much more likely to get a lighter sentence or a DPA, our version of the DPA. But really, it's about ultimately, it's how are they demonstrating that they have actually addressed the problem that occurred initially. How have they mitigated, and what proof do they have? Because it's not just to say we found this and we remediated. They need to be able to demonstrate it in practical fashion as to what the remediation process that they've used, what type of tool they have. And honestly, in today's business environment with this huge amount of challenges, it's not just about addressing what might happen from a regulatory perspective or investigative perspective. It's also from a business perspective. Because when you have joint ventures, when you're bidding for a contract for the government or anything within the business environment we have today, it's that lack of clarity that increases the uncertainty. And if you have a company that is basing their business objective on ethics and compliance, that clarity is going to be there. It's going to be much easier for them to demonstrate and to build trust with their partner or the contract offer. So it's really important for organization today to be much more aware of what the risk they're facing, but what are they putting in place to really embed within the organization that culture of ethics and compliance that is anchored on risk management mindset.
Well, let me change the focus a little bit to down the road. And I want to start by asking, you mentioned your association with, I believe, the University of Ottawa.
Yep. And other
universities. And I also teach a compliance and ethics course in a law school. But I wondered, what advice might you give an undergraduate or graduate student or even a law student about coming into the compliance profession circa 2025?
Very good question. I teach and I lecture at the law school and a business school. And the new generation are much less accepting of unethical behavior. They're much more willing to raise their hand and go on social media and say, this company is not doing the right thing, but labor laws or child labor laws or the environment or any of the other issues. And they want to get into this ethics and compliance framework where they want to help the company succeed, but making sure they're doing it the right way. And what I'm finding, what the feedback I'm getting from students is that they see the ethics and compliance function as critical because it is a business enabler. It is that function that it's not the office of no. It protects the reputation of the organization. It increases profitability and productivity when it's done right. And those students, what they're looking for is working for a company that is aligned with their own values and that they can demonstrate that they are aware of the impact of the business within their own country or other countries and help them get there. But transparency, accountability are words that I'm hearing all the time from them. And if the organization has a strong ethics and compliance program, it's not going to be hard to attract these type of employees and to keep them. The high profile, the champions that will really be embedded and align with the business objectives, but it needs to be part of not just words on a piece of paper, but really embedded within the culture.
That's really interesting because I talk to a lot of hiring professionals and they believe the biggest differentiation between successful and unsuccessful businesses will not be the incorporation of AI, but will be talent acquisition and retention. And you just exactly said that.
Yeah,
And the generation coming after us, they do see things differently, just like we saw
totally.
things differently from our generations before us. Where do you see maybe compliance down the road circa 2030?
I think if you look at the evolution of technology, it's going to have a huge impact on how we conduct our business, especially in the ethics and compliance field, where there's going to be greater focus on those cultural metrics. How do you measure success? How do you measure compliance activity? How do you measure ethical outcomes? Okay, so because you need to be able to trust internally with your stakeholders, but also externally. And it's going to turn from an annual audit to real-time assurance of alignment with the regulations, the ethics and compliance expectations. But the people themselves, how are they going to be able to adopt this? Because it's transformative. The technology is transformative on the job. And a lot of people are afraid that it's going to take away my job. Really, there's going to be disruption? Absolutely. But AI is not going to take away all your jobs. It's somebody who knows how to leverage AI will take away your job. So it's learning how to use these tools. It's transformative. I'm a techie. Okay, I geek out on this stuff. Okay, but it's how to deploy it properly. So it's not just going willy-nilly and get into the hype of AI. It's how are you using it for your use cases? How you're planning for it. It's like any change management. You need to test it within a sandbox. You need to be able to deploy, engage your end user with it, and then have them, create new workflows or new use cases for it. The successful companies that are using technology and the next generation who are embedded within this technology are allowing them to play in the sandbox. I've got one company in particular, once a month on a Friday, for 2 hours, they let them create new workflows, new use cases for these agentic AIs, new AI tools to improve existing workflows or to look at new use cases. Again, to meet business objectives, but at least it increases AI literacy and it favors the use and creativity of new ways of doing business. And so this is how I see it. But also, we need from the ethics and compliance field, Tom, and I think you've mentioned in the past, we need to change the way we sell ourselves. How are we being viewed in the ethics and compliance field? Not the officer, no. We need to be seen as the business partner and enabler, and bringing these tools to bear to improve business efficiencies.
Pat, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode. But before we leave, I wanted to ask you if our listeners wanted any more information on yourself, about your businesses, or really the topics you touched on, what might be the best place or places they can go?
They can reach me on LinkedIn or just on the ACEG, so Active Compliance and Ethics Group, or by email. And I'd be happy to share the white paper or anything, or if they have questions, I'd be happy to help anybody in this field.
Well, Pat, I wanted to thank you again. It's like I said, way overdue, and I'm not going to let it go that long again. So I hope we can continue this discussion.
Thank you for the invitation. It was a blast.